In a dimly lit parking garage, a veteran officer shoves a woman against her car, sneering as he tells her she doesn't belong here. What he doesn't realize, he just assaulted his own chief of police. Now, faced with corruption, betrayal, and a department fighting against change, how will she respond? Will she bring justice, or will the system strike back? Stay tuned to find out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The city of Denver, Colorado, was undergoing a shift. A battle between old-school policing and progressive reforms was brewing within the police department. Chief Elena Vasquez, a determined Latina woman in her early 40s, had been appointed as the new chief of police just 6 months ago. Her mission? To clean up a department plagued by discrimination, buried misconduct reports, and a toxic brotherhood culture that protected bad cops at the expense of the community. Not everyone welcomed her leadership. Among the most vocal opponents was Officer Jack Callahan, a 20-year veteran of the force. Callahan represented the old guard, officers who resented change, especially when it came from a woman, let alone a Latina woman. Sitting in the precinct's break room, Callahan leaned back in his chair, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate motions. His voice dripped with condescension as he spoke to a fellow officer. Callahan scoffed. "You hear what the chief's trying to do now? Another damn accountability initiative. This department used to be about real policing, not this woke nonsense." Officer Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, some things probably do need to change, Jack." Callahan shot him a glare. "Don't tell me you're buying into this." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "She doesn't belong here, Ryan. She's trying to tear down everything we built." Vasquez knew this resistance existed. She had faced doubt, skepticism, even hostility from within her own ranks. But she had earned every step up the ladder, working twice as hard to prove herself in a system designed to keep people like her out of power. That night, she stayed late, reviewing personnel files, including a growing list of complaints against Callahan. 7 in the past 3 years alone. Excessive force, racial profiling, reports that had been conveniently buried. When she finally left her office and walked into the dimly lit underground parking garage, she had no idea that she was about to have a confrontation that would change everything. She had no idea that within minutes, Officer Callahan would shove her against her car, tell her she didn't belong, and unknowingly assault his own chief of police. And when that moment came, he would regret it. The underground parking garage, beneath the Denver Police Department, was nearly empty. The dim yellow lights flickered, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. Chief Elena Vasquez had just wrapped up another late night at the office, reviewing personnel files and budget reports. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder and sighed, making her way toward her unmarked patrol car. The silence was suddenly broken. "Hey, step away from the vehicle." A sharp voice rang out, echoing through the garage. Vasquez turned, instinctively reaching for her badge. Standing a few yards away was Officer Jack Callahan, his hand resting on his holstered gun. His posture was aggressive, his stance wide, as if preparing for a confrontation. "Excuse me?" Vasquez asked, keeping her tone calm but firm. Callahan narrowed his eyes. "I said, step back. This is a restricted area." Vasquez could already sense where this was going. She had dealt with men like Callahan before, the kind who judged authority by appearance rather than credentials. Dressed in plain clothes, she didn't look like a cop, let alone the highest-ranking officer in the department. "I have authorization to be here," she stated evenly. Callahan scoffed. "Yeah? By who?" She opened her mouth to answer, But before she could, Callahan closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. I said, "Step back," he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. "I don't take orders from civilians." His hand twitched over his gun. Vasquez lifted her hand slightly. "Officer, you don't want to do this." Callahan sneered. "People like you don't belong here after hours." There it was. The words hung in the air like a slap to the face. People like you. Vasquez felt the familiar sting of thinly veiled prejudice, but she refused to react emotionally. Instead, she held her ground. "Think carefully about your next words, officer," she warned, her voice low, controlled. Callahan ignored her. In a sudden movement, he shoved her hard against her car. The force of the impact knocked the breath from her lungs. "I don't take suggestions from trespassers," he growled. For a split second, the garage fell into absolute silence. Then Vasquez straightened. She brushed off her jacket with slow, deliberate movements, her eyes never leaving Callahan's. Then, with measured calm, she reached into her pocket. Callahan stiffened, his fingers instinctively tightened around his gun. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he warned. Vasquez smirked. "Oh, I think you're going to wish I did." She pulled out a shiny police badge and held it up. The bold letters read, "Chief of Police, Elena Vasquez." Callahan's face went pale. His mouth opened, then closed, as he struggled to process what had just happened. The woman he had just assaulted, the civilian he had just shoved, was his commanding officer. Vasquez took a step forward, closing the space between them. Her voice, now ice cold, cut through the thick tension. "Would you like to explain," she said slowly, "why you just assaulted your chief of police?" Callahan was frozen in place, trapped in his own mistake. And in that moment he realized he had just ruined his entire career. For a moment, Officer Jack Callahan stood frozen, his face drained of color. The shiny badge in Chief Elena Vasquez's hand gleamed under the dim garage lights, an undeniable symbol of his monumental mistake. "Chief, Callahan stammered, his voice suddenly stripped of its usual arrogance. Vasquez tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a predator assesses its prey. "Go ahead," she said coolly. "Finish that sentence." Callahan swallowed hard, but no words came. He had spent years barking orders, expecting immediate obedience, but now he was the one answering to authority. Vasquez took a deliberate step forward, forcing him to take one back. "You assumed I didn't belong here," she continued, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. "You used force against an unarmed person. You escalated a situation without cause." Her eyes flickered toward his holster, where his hand still hovered uncertainly. "And tell me, officer," she added, "were you planning to draw your weapon?" "No, of course not," Callahan blurted out. Vasquez let the silence stretch, watching the sweat bead along his forehead. She wanted him to sit in his own discomfort, to feel the gravity of his actions. "Tomorrow morning, my office. First thing." Her tone left no room for argument. "We will be discussing your conduct, as well as your future in this department." "Chief, dismissed." Callahan clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. For once, he had no power here. Slowly he turned and walked away, his steps lacking their usual confidence. As Vasquez exhaled, she became aware of a new presence. Near the entrance of the garage, Officer Lisa Monroe, one of the department's younger officers, stood watching. She had seen everything. "Monroe," Vasquez acknowledged, adjusting her jacket. "Chief," Monroe replied, hesitating. "Are you okay?" Vasquez offered a small, knowing smirk. "Oh, I'm fine." Callahan, on the other hand, he's about to have the worst day of his life. Monroe exhaled, clearly relieved. It's about time someone put him in his place. Vasquez glanced toward the exit where Callahan had disappeared. Oh, I'm not just putting him in his place, she murmured. I'm about to put this entire department under a microscope. And with that, she turned and strode toward her car. The first battle had just been won, but the war was far from over. The next morning, Chief Elena Vasquez arrived at her office earlier than usual. The confrontation with Officer Jack Callahan still fresh in her mind. She didn't just want disciplinary action. She wanted answers. As she sat at her desk, she pulled out Callahan's personnel file. It was thicker than most, a collection of commendations, internal notes, and buried complaints. 7 civilian complaints. In the last 3 years alone. All dismissed. She wasn't surprised. A sharp knock at the door made her look up. Captain Lucas Hernandez, head of internal affairs, walked in, a thick folder in his hand. "Morning, Chief," Hernandez said, setting the folder on her desk. "I assume you'll want to see this." Vasquez gestured for him to continue. "Tell me what I already suspect." Hernandez sighed. "Callahan has a pattern: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Every time someone filed a complaint, it just—" He tapped the file, disappeared. Vasquez exhaled, tapping her fingers against her desk. "Who's been covering for him?" Hernandez opened the folder, flipping to an email chain. "Former Chief Wilson, for one." He pointed to highlighted text. "Instructed supervisors to handle complaints internally." "Meaning?" "Bury them." Vasquez clenched her jaw. "And the others?" "Several high-ranking officers, including some still in the department. Callahan isn't the disease, he's a symptom." Vasquez leaned back in her chair, processing the scope of corruption. Watney, this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system designed to protect them. Another knock at the door. This time, it was Detective Lisa Monroe, hesitation in her stance. "Chief, can I speak freely?" Vasquez nodded. "Close the door." Monroe stepped inside, lowering her voice. "Callahan's been talking. He's telling people you're trying to purge the department, that you have a personal vendetta." Vasquez let out a humorless chuckle. "Let them talk. Facts don't care about rumors." Monroe shook her head. "It's not just talk. There's a group of officers rallying behind him. They're planning to push back." That got Vasquez's attention. "Push back how?" Monroe hesitated. "Some are trying to get the police union involved. Others are saying they'll refuse to cooperate with any of your reforms." Hernandez muttered a curse under his breath. "They're protecting their own," he said. Vasquez's expression hardened. "I knew there'd be resistance," she said. "But let's make one thing clear. This department serves the people, not itself. If anyone thinks they're above accountability, they can pack their damn bags." Silence filled the room for a moment. Then Monroe nodded. "I just wanted you to know what you're up against, Chief." Vasquez smirked. "Oh, I already know. And trust me, it's about to get a lot worse for them before it gets better." As Monroe and Hernandez left, Vasquez turned her chair toward the window, staring out over Denver. The battle lines were being drawn, and she was more than ready for war. The tension inside the Denver Police Department was palpable. Officers were whispering in break rooms, choosing sides. Some, especially the younger recruits, quietly supported Chief Elena Vasquez and her efforts to clean up the department. Others, especially those who had been on the force for decades, stood firmly behind Jack Callahan, convinced he was being targeted unfairly. That morning, as Vasquez entered her office, Captain Lucas Hernandez was already there, arms crossed, his expression grim. "You're going to want to see this," he said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. Vasquez opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Internal emails, redacted complaint reports, transcripts from closed investigations. But the most damning, a confidential email exchange between former Chief Wilson and Callahan. "Handle this quietly. We don't need another media circus," Vasquez read aloud, her voice sharp. She looked up at Hernandez. "They buried everything." Hernandez nodded. "And it gets worse. We just got word from an anonymous source. Callahan wasn't acting alone. He had help covering up excessive force complaints from high-ranking officers. Some are still in the department." Vasquez leaned back, exhaling slowly. "So, this is bigger than Callahan," she murmured. Hernandez nodded. "Much bigger." Before she could respond, Detective Lisa Monroe entered the office, her face tense. "Chief, we have a problem." Vasquez motioned for her to continue. "Callahan's team is fighting back. They're reaching out to the police union, claiming you're creating a hostile work environment." Vasquez let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "A hostile work environment?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's rich, considering Callahan shoved me against a car." Monroe crossed her arms. "They're painting him as the victim. Word is, he's also talking to the media." That got Vasquez's full attention. "He wants to play this in public," she said. "Fine. Let's see how he likes it when the truth comes out." She reached for her phone and dialed Richard Morton, a veteran reporter from the Denver Post who had covered corruption cases before. "Morton, it's Vasquez." "Chief?" Morton's voice came through, intrigued. "Calling to comment on the Callahan scandal?" "No," Vasquez replied, her tone ice cold. "I'm calling to give you something bigger." She laid out the facts: years of buried complaints, corruption among senior officers, the systematic protection of bad cops. "And you can prove this?" Morton asked. "I wouldn't be calling you if I couldn't," Vasquez responded. Morton was silent for a moment before exhaling. "This is going to explode." Vasquez smirked. "Good. Let it." As she hung up, she turned to Hernandez and Monroe. "This department has been protecting the wrong people for too long. That ends today." The storm was about to break, and Vasquez was ready to fight. The Denver Police Internal Affairs hearing was packed. Officers, city officials, reporters, everyone was there, waiting to see how the scandal would unfold. At the front of the room, Chief Elena Vasquez sat with Captain Lucas Hernandez and Detective Lisa Monroe by her side. Across from them, Jack Callahan sat stiffly, flanked by his attorney, Harrison Wells, a well-known defender of police unions. Chairwoman Eleanor Blackwood, a former federal judge, called the hearing to order. Her sharp gaze swept over the room before she spoke. "We are here today to investigate allegations of misconduct, excessive force, and suppression of complaints within the Denver Police Department." Callahan's lawyer, Wells, stood immediately. "My client is a decorated officer with over 20 years of service. This so-called investigation is nothing more than a political attack by Chief Vasquez, who has made it clear she wants to purge veteran officers." Vasquez didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly pushed a USB drive across the table. "I'd like to enter new evidence into the record," she said calmly. Blackwood nodded. A screen flickered on as Hernandez played security footage from the parking garage, the unedited version. The room watched in stunned silence as Callahan appeared on screen, his posture aggressive, his hand resting on his gun. They saw him shove Vasquez against her car, heard his sneering voice. "People like you don't belong here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Callahan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face reddening. Blackwood turned to him. "Officer Callahan, would you care to explain what we just watched?" Callahan's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously to him. But Callahan, His ego bruised, spoke up. That was taken out of context. He snapped. I thought she was a civilian. I was protecting department property. Vasquez tilted her head. And that justifies using force? I didn't know who she was, Callahan insisted. Hernandez cut in. So, just to clarify, if she weren't your chief, you'd still think shoving an unarmed person was justified? The room went silent. Callahan's jaw clenched. He had walked right into their trap. Blackwood turned to Vasquez. Chief, do you have anything further? Vasquez nodded. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern. Hernandez handed out documents, internal emails, buried complaints, reports of Callahan's past misconduct. Over the past 5 years, Officer Callahan has been named in at least 7 excessive force complaints, all of which were mysteriously dismissed. But here's where it gets interesting. He isn't the only one. She gestured to the screen again. A list of names appeared. Several high-ranking officers implicated in covering up misconduct. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Officers whispered among themselves. Blackwood called for order and turned to Callahan. Officer Callahan, in light of this evidence, the committee will be recommending your immediate termination. Callahan's face twisted in fury. This is a goddamn witch hunt, he exploded. This department is being taken over by political correctness. That was his final mistake. Blackwood's expression turned to steel. Officer Callahan, you have just provided further evidence of the toxic culture within this department. You are dismissed. As Callahan stormed out, Vasquez exhaled. The battle wasn't over, but today was a victory. The next morning, the Denver Police Department felt different. The tension hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. Jack Callahan was gone. His termination was official, and an internal investigation into other officers involved in cover-ups was now underway. Chief Elena Vasquez stood in her office, watching the city skyline through her window. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was the first real victory. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Captain Lucas Hernandez stepped in, a document in hand. Thought you'd want to see this, he said, placing it on her desk. Vasquez picked it up, skimming the first few lines. It was an official memo, ordering a full review of all civilian complaints dismissed in the last 5 years. She let out a slow breath. It's finally happening. Hernandez nodded. It's long overdue. Before Vasquez could respond, Detective Lisa Monroe walked in, holding her phone up. Chief, you might want to see this. On the screen was a live news broadcast. The mayor was speaking at a press conference. Chief Vasquez's leadership marks a turning point for this department, he said. Her commitment to justice will help rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. Vasquez arched an eyebrow. Nice of him to get on board now, she muttered. Monroe smirked. Better late than never. As Vasquez set the phone down, she exhaled. The real work was just beginning. The old ways were crumbling, and for the first time, true change was on the horizon. That evening, Chief Elena Vasquez walked out of the Denver Police Department, the crisp night air wrapping around her. The city was alive, sirens in the distance, headlights gliding along the wet streets. But tonight, everything felt different, lighter. She stopped for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the underground parking lot, the very place where this all started. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. Long day? She turned to see Detective Lisa Monroe, leaning against a patrol car, arms crossed, a small smirk on her face. Vasquez exhaled. A long year. Monroe nodded. But you did it, Chief. Vasquez gave a small, knowing smile. Did I? Monroe gestured toward the station. Callahan's gone. The corruption's exposed. Officers who thought they were untouchable are finally answering for their actions. And the ones who believe in this job for the right reasons, they're stepping up. That's because of you. Vasquez let the words settle. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her brother. You changed things, Elena. Grandma would be proud. She swallowed the lump in her throat, slipping her phone away. It's not over, she murmured. Change takes time. Monroe nodded. Yeah, but for the first time, it's actually happening. Vasquez glanced once more at the parking lot, then at the station behind her. Her station. She smirked. Let's get to work. And with that, she walked toward her car, the city lights stretching before her. The future of Denver policing forever changed. The story of Chief Elena Vasquez is more than just a tale of justice. It's a powerful reminder of why accountability, courage, and integrity matter in leadership and in everyday life. One of the key takeaways is that change doesn't happen without resistance. Whether it's in law enforcement, the workplace, or society as a whole, those who benefit from a broken system will always fight to keep it intact. Vasquez knew this, yet she refused to back down. Her persistence teaches us that doing what's right isn't about popularity, it's about principles. Another lesson is the importance of speaking up. Officers like Detective Monroe and Captain Hernandez had a choice: to stay silent or to stand for the truth. They chose the latter, proving that even in a corrupt system, individual actions can create waves of change. For us, the story serves as a reminder to hold people in power accountable. Whether it's in law enforcement, government, or even within our own communities, it encourages us to challenge bias, support ethical leadership, and ensure that justice isn't just a word, but a practice. Because in the end, real change starts when people refuse to stay silent. This story reminds us that justice isn't automatic. It takes bold leadership and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Chief Vasquez risked everything to bring real change, but not everyone would have done the same. So, what about you? If you were in her shoes, would you stand your ground and expose the truth, 1, or keep your head down and avoid conflict, 2? Drop a 1 or 2 in the comments. I can't wait to see your perspectives. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories of courage and justice.